Rules Committee will come to order, and thank you very much for being with us today as the Rules Committee meets to consider H.R. 2575, the Save American Workers Act. This important piece of legislation, written and submitted by the young chairman from Indiana, Todd Young, makes an important change to the Affordable Care Act's definition of full-time worker. Currently, any employee working more than 30 hours per week is classified as a full-time employee. As a result of the employer mandate, his or her employer must either provide health insurance or pay a tax penalty. Unfortunately, many workers are seeing their hours reduced as businesses react to the burdensome and job-destroying policies of what is referred to as the Affordable Care Act, or many times known as Obamacare. According to a Hoover Institute study, 2.6 million Americans making under $30,000 per year are at risk of having their hours and their wages cut as a result of this 30-hour rule that was in the Affordable Care Act known as Obamacare. Of those 2.6 million people, 90% do not have a college degree, 63% are women, and 60% are between the ages of 19 and 34. Simply put, this unnecessary regulation is hurting the American workers who least can afford it. Perhaps your children or mine. I believe they are entitled to the benefits of having a job and a career without the strong interference of the United States government. H.R. 2575 protects American jobs, promotes the free enterprise system, and reduces the crippling effects of this law on our young people and all of us as a nation. By increasing the employer mandate threshold from 30 to 40 hours per week, today's legislation provides this body the opportunity to prevent millions of American workers from having their hourly wages cut and to see their paychecks shrink and become more reliant upon the federal government and to literally beg Washington to please get out of their lives. I want to thank our colleagues for joining us today. I recognize the gentlewoman, the ranking member of the committee, is on her way up. As a matter of fact, Mrs. Slaughter is just now arriving, and I want to thank her for being here today. And without objection, if she wishes to make an opening statement, the gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Thank you. No, I have no opening statement.
The gentlewoman has no opening statement. Mr. Young, I want to thank you for being here today. This important legislation that you bring to us today, I think, is the backbone of the comments that I have received about how we are diminishing what is known as the 40-hour work week. And I think your discussion as not only the person who brought this important piece of legislation to us, but a person who studied this perhaps more than any of us. I'm delighted to have you as an expert witness today. Without objection, anything you have in writing will be entered in the record. The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Ranking Member, for having me here today to talk about this important issue. I know it's on the mind of all of us because we're no doubt hearing from our constituents about the need for more jobs, more hours, higher wages, and so forth. And this particular provision in the Affordable Care Act, the 30-hour definition of full-time, is dramatically impairing the ability of our most at-risk workers to get more hours, to pay their bills, to support their families, and so forth. And so I'm here prepared to briefly give an overview of exactly what's at stake, and then to talk about how we can fix that. I'd like to submit our larger statement I have, more lengthy statement for the record. You know, the administration continues to pick and choose various provisions of the Affordable Care Act that they want to implement. But one particularly harmful provision does remain intact, and it's this 30 hours full-time provision. Under the ACA, the government defines for the first time in our nation's history, in statute, the definition of full-time. And this could have implications beyond the realm of health care, it's worth noting. When you're suddenly employed full-time and a court recognizes 30 hours as full-time employment, that can lead to all sorts of adverse implications. But specifically, this provision mandates employers with more than 50 employees provide government-approved insurance to all of those employees working more than 30 hours. And we've heard not just from employees of private sector companies, but we've heard from teachers, cafeteria workers, custodians, employees of local government, and so many others about this provision. And the White House says that various delays are to help employers, but it should be even more apparent that low and medium income employees are the ones who are actually suffering most under this mandate as written. The real result of the 30-hour rule is fewer jobs, reduced hours and wages, and less opportunity for Americans. And, in Indiana's 9th Congressional District, as in districts all around the country, I know this is what all of our constituents are asking for, is just more economic opportunity. They want us to remove barriers to people realizing their full potential. This provision is one of those barriers. We've all heard the stories back in Indiana. I've heard them from Indiana University, major employer in my hometown of Bloomington, Indiana. I've heard them from Ivy Tech Community College, where 4,500 adjunct professors are having their hours dropped and thus losing wages during what some have argued is the worst economy since the Great Depression. These organizations are taking steps to limit the hours of student employees and reduce the number of classes that adjunct professors can teach. In fact, I was recently at a public school corporation in Salem, Indiana, where I heard from a superintendent of the local schools, and she indicated that there have been occasions where substitute teachers are having to leave the classroom early so that they don't hit that 30-hour threshold, thus leaving the students at their own disposal. That's, of course, of concern to parents and teachers and administrators alike. Ivy Tech testified before the Ways and Means Committee that complying with the 30-hour provision and not reducing employee hours would have resulted in a $12 million unfunded mandate annually. This is just for one community college system. I've also heard from 39 separate school districts in Indiana. They've sued the federal government due to the, quote, catastrophic financial consequences that this provision's having on our nation's school children. Industries that employ lower-skilled workers and often provide entry-level opportunities for Americans are disproportionately affected by this 30-hour rule. According to recent research cited by the chairman from the Hoover Institution, but I think it's worth reiterating, this rule puts 2.6 million workers with a median income of under $30,000 at risk for losing their job and losing hours. So this proposal, the Save American Workers Act, is a common sense change, and I note it's a change with some bipartisan support that would help protect the wages of Americans who most depend on them. The fear from some on the other side that such a change might exacerbate the problem of reduced hours ignores the fundamental problem of this provision, and it fails to see the realities of the American labor market. And I'd be happy to speak to any questions related to that. The proposal limits the labor disruption of the ACA. In fact, CBO analysis confirms this. It indicates that the SAW Act will generate $9 billion in payroll taxes and translate to $75 billion in cash wages for our hourly workers. This is proof positive that it does, in fact, preserve the hours and wages of hardworking Americans. So I'll just close by saying this is a straightforward, commonsensical piece of legislation that ought to cross any partisan divide that might exist. All of us are hearing from our workers We're hearing from union workers. We're hearing from private sector employees. We're hearing from hourly workers. We're hearing from Americans that are frustrated at the suboptimal levels of growth that being experienced in this country. If we can put more people back to work doing what they do best so that they can feed their families and make their bill payments and so forth, that will in the end benefit all of us, and to me that's consistent with realizing the American dream. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Young, I have the bill before me right now, and the first page and we'll say half are co-sponsors. And then the bill is essentially just 4 pages, 3.5 or 4 pages in length. The piece part of this, really the essence is to say, don't tell employers that they have to kill the 40-hour work week. Is that just the whole essence of this bill that's right here for me, this simple 3.5-page bill?
That's right. As James Hoffa, the president of Teamsters, has put it, the 40-hour work week is the backbone of the American economy, and the ACA will kill the 40-hour work week. This bill will help address that malignant provision within the ACA.
So what you're really trying to do here is to say that people who work for a 40-hour work week are getting less money in their paycheck because they're working less hours, they're getting less money?
That's right. Let's just take a scenario, break it down to the average worker. If we take a worker who's at, say, 38 or 39 hours of hourly work per week, and then we factor in the incentives created by the ACA's 30 hours as full-time provision, there are many businesses right now operating on very thin margins. Many other enterprises or institutions like universities and public school corporations who are trying to do the best they can with the resources they have. And so they're incentivized to drop employees below this 30-hour threshold because they cannot afford to remain viable entities, continue to employ these same workers, and still provide Obamacare-sanctioned health insurance. So that 38 or 39-hour per week employee is very likely to be dropped down to 29 or 28 hours per week, losing 10 hours a week. Over the course of a month, they've lost an entire works week worth of wages. And I've yet to encounter a Hoosier who says, I would rather have this provision in there than an entire works week worth of wages.
And then the practical effect is they lose their health care because the employer did this because they were given that opportunity. Is that right?
Well, the practical effect is they lose the ability to work the number of hours they require to meet all of their bills.
Right.
They're still going to have health care. They're still going to have health insurance. And regrettably, they're not going to be able to not just put more money in their pockets, but acquire the skills that allow them to move up the economic ladder.
Good. Well, let me tell you, I'm delighted to be on the bill. You asked me a long time ago. It was a good idea, and I'm delighted that you're here today. Mrs. Fox?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm delighted that Congressman Young is here also. I have no questions. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Gentlewoman yields back time. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I don't have any questions either, but I'd like to make a couple of statements. First, from the letter sent to us by the minority of the Ways and Means Committee. Because of short notice, the Joint Committee on Taxation and Congressional Budget Office were unable to provide the committee with estimates on both cost and insurance coverage changes as a result of the bill. One reason the analysis is unavailable is because the effects of the legislation are so complicated. Given that this legislation could result in substantial compensation coverage shifts for anyone who works between 30 and 40 hours a week, it will have significant budgetary effects, including both the loss of revenue and increased federal spending. Under the legislation, employers will no longer be required to offer affordable coverage or to pay the free rider penalty to help offset their employees' health coverage in exchange or Medicaid. Now, also, I have over here some things that I think are important. The estimate is that this bill would increase the deficit by $75 billion, that 1 million would lose their employer health coverage. And since the ACA passed, the United States economy has added 8.6 million private sector jobs, proving that it has been no job killer, and no increase at all, according to BLS, in part-time labor. So we've heard all that was going to happen, but it hasn't happened. In fact, some companies have moved their part-time people to full-time. I'm sure you're aware of that. Now, one thing I would like to clear up, because I don't think you meant to say it, but when you were quoting James Hoffa, you said that James Hoffa said that the 40-hour work week is the backbone of the American economy. 40-hour work week's been in effect for a very long time. Then you said that ACA was going to kill it. Were you saying that that's what Mr. Hoffa said, or was that your addition to what Mr. Hoffa said?
I actually have here in my materials Mr. Hoffa's quote.
Okay, I'd like to hear
it. He said that this rule, this Affordable Care Act 30-hour provision will, quote, destroy the foundation of the 40-hour work week that's the backbone of the American middle class, unquote. And we can search that. I certainly don't want to misquote Mr. Hoffa.
Well, I wouldn't want you to either, because I know he's worked diligently on this bill and getting passed it, and it has his full approval.
Well,
so I find that strange. Yes, he did.
That's right.
Yes. And did a lot of us. And to tell you the truth, Mr. Young, I appreciate your being here, and it's nice to have you come up to the Rules Committee. But this is flogging a dead horse. This is the 52nd time we're going to vote to kill health care. And when all the numbers are in, you know the RAND study, I don't know if you heard that quoted this weekend or not, claims that it's not just 7.1 million people in this last month, but that 20 million people in the United States now are benefiting, if you count all the children who are on their parents' health insurance, and also the number of persons who have signed up on their own through the insurance companies. I must say, I have to repeat what the President keeps saying. Why is it that you all don't want people to have health insurance? What is the problem with making health insurance available to people who couldn't have it because they had a pre-existing condition or that they couldn't afford it? And that suddenly we're going to try to make that available. The family won't go bankrupt, for example, which I think is a very important thing, since most private bankruptcies were because of health care costs. That burden now will be shifted to the insurance companies. What's wrong with that? I mean, you weren't here when we did the bill. Am I correct about that?
You are correct. May I respond to multiple questions?
I think it's important to know this. We did not do this health care bill, or the Clinton one that preceded it, because we wanted to aggravate people. In my case, I didn't do it because I wanted people to throw bricks through my office window in Niagara Falls or threaten the lives of my grandchildren, so the FBI and police had to watch them getting off and on the school bus. We did it because it was 18% of GDP and growing, and we could not afford that any longer. And in addition, the 30 million Americans with no insurance, with pre-existing conditions, was very much on our mind and our conscience.
So let me start on a positive note, and I so appreciate the questions, and I'll do my best to unpack the number of questions and comments and try and respond accordingly. I would love to work with you to try and create a better healthcare environment for all Americans. I would love to work with you to put together a healthcare legal environment where all Americans can enjoy health insurance. We won't have that under the Affordable Care Act. I would love to work with you on a sustainable piece of healthcare legislation that actually ensures that those who most need work are able to find work and work the number of hours they require to pay their utility bills, to feed their families, to put clothes on their children, to pay for shelter, and to do all these other things that are so essential.
The Affordable Care Act is going to destroy their ability to do that? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not just, I don't want to personalize this.
More jobs created.
My constituents believe that.
Okay.
Many champions of this legislation, like Teamsters President Hoffa, that's why I invoked him. Many on your side of the aisle, if you look at the co-sponsor list, who are champions of this legislation.
Well, I can assure you Mr. Hoffa doesn't believe that, and I'll have him write that down.
Okay.
Thanks.
Maybe he can clarify that this 30-hour provision is something the Teamsters Union is okay with. With respect to the 7 million insured, I would note that we're still seeking information about who's actually paid, and so. Well, it's our job as members of Congress, and I'm a member of the Ways and Means Committee, to oversee the books, and I know you'll agree with that. I would note that there's a concern about people losing employer-sponsored insurance, and I share your concern. The Affordable Care Act causes 7 million Americans, according to the CBO, to lose their employer-sponsored insurance. So that's a great concern. But, all these things have to be balanced, and we've struck the appropriate balance with the Save American Workers Act here, in terms of ensuring that Americans will still have access to health insurance, but also have access to those hours and wages that they so desperately need, especially our individuals who are heads of households in the $30,000 and less range. 9 out of 10 Americans who will be helped by this legislation fall within that income demographic. I happen to be sympathetic to them. I think they need some extra assistance and attention, and this bill will help that group. 3 out of 5 individuals who will benefit from this legislation are women. We need to pay particular attention to that fact. And so, yes, there's some complication associated with analyzing this. There's far more complication associated, we found, with the Affordable Care Act itself. So that's not an argument against this smaller provision to repeal a suboptimal definition of full-time employment within the ACA. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back time. Gentleman from Utah is recognized. Gentleman does not seek time at this time. Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
No, I thank you for coming. And look, we have the Statement of Administration policy that says if the President were presented with this bill, he would veto it, not recommend, but he would veto it. And so my problem with what we're doing today is that we're yet again bringing legislation before the House that has no chance of going anywhere. And so I would repeat my request that this committee should be considering an extension of unemployment benefits for the long-term unemployed who are desperately looking for some help from us, and that at least some indication that we care about their plight. We ought to be talking about raising the minimum wage in this country. There are people working full-time in this country who are still living in poverty. They work full-time, and because of the minimum wage, require the assistance from SNAP and every other kind of government assistance program. We ought to be talking about making their life a little bit easier so that they don't have to rely on government assistance. And we ought to be talking about comprehensive immigration reform, which, by the way, will save. You want to talk about saving money? CBO estimates it would save us a boatload of money over the next decade. And I would just close, Mr. Chairman, by reminding you that to keep the House open, I think the Library of Congress has said it's about $24 million a week to keep the House of Representatives going. I'd like to think that sometime during this week or next week that we might actually do something that's going to help them. And this is not the bill. In fact, this bill I don't even think is even paid for. Maybe I'm wrong on that, but I don't think, this bill is not even paid for. So I would just again respectfully request that the chairman use his influence with his leadership to bring one of these measures to the floor so that we can go home and actually justify to our constituents that we're we're worthy of the salaries and the costs that it takes to keep this House open?
I appreciate the gentleman asking questions, and in fact, what I believe Mr. Young is here doing, what I believe the previous, if it is true, 51 times, I was hoping to be 52.
It may be 52, I don't know.
It may be.
So you want to know what I think about this bill? Just Xerox my previous testimonies.
I will respond. Yeah. Each of these things that we have brought forth are important components of the things that eventually the President ends up waiving, many of them. We try and bring them up. We try and negotiate with the President. We try and make sure the American people understand what's going on. With the health care, they're worried. They're scared about their future. We have unemployment for young people that is literally at an all-time high. And we look up as members of Congress after hearing employers talk, and we're trying to do something about that. So what I would say to you is I think each of these piece parts that we have brought forth are important components, and I believe the message is getting down to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, because within a few weeks the President changes his mind. What he said he disagreed with us on and then put a sap up here saying he would never do, we'd do it if it was our idea, but sooner or later it makes sense, and so the President waves his wand and just simply waives the requirements of the bill. I've been aware for a long time that Democrats have said we ought to fix everything that's wrong with it. Well, why don't you just tell us? And why don't you tell us what's wrong with the bill then if you don't like what we're doing, and let's work on it. But instead of finding good ideas, so I'll challenge you today, why don't you tell me everything that you think that's wrong with the bill that you'd like to perfect and change, and then let's work on that together. Mr. Young, I bet, would be willing to do that.
I'll be happy to provide
Good.
you that.
I'd love
but
to
if
do
I
that.
could just maybe rephrase my question this way. So, look, we'll probably be talking about repealing the Affordable Care Act for the 900th time. All I'm suggesting is in between these debates that we might want to think about voting on the extension of unemployment benefits for the long-term unemployed, raising the minimum wage, and passing comprehensive immigration reform. I'd like to think maybe we could do that as well.
We had saving antibiotics.
And saving antibiotics, the Louise Slaughter bill as well. And I would urge my colleague to do this not as a favor to the President, but I think that as a favor to the American people. I yield back my time.
Well, thank you very much. I want to just, if I can, because I'm asked to substantiate you being here today, Mr. Young, and I want to quote from a gentleman who is Lan He Chen, Ph.D., Stanford University, Research Fellow, Hoover Institute, on his report, page 7, and he concludes by saying, the final reason I argue the 30-hour rule must be addressed is because the negative impact it has on school districts, colleges, and universities. The backbone of people who were trying to be inside the school classroom teaching our young children, and yet this law is most destructive with them. So I'm going to sustain why you're here, and that this Congress, this House of Representatives is doing the right thing. And as a matter of fact, I applaud you for your hard work, and will say this is worth the time of not just the Rules Committee, but the House of Representatives. Gentleman from Oklahoma is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and you make a very important point that I think is worth reiterating, actually several of them, but I want to begin with a question to my friend from Indiana. Does this bill repeal the Affordable Care Act?
No, it
So
does
it's
not.
clearly not an effort to repeal one of 50-odd that we hear about constantly. It's an effort to fix, which is precisely what the President of the United States invited us to do, if I recall correctly.
It's an effort to work together in a bipartisan way to mitigate the pain some people are feeling as a result of some provisions.
Do you have Democratic support and co-sponsors?
We do indeed.
Has there been significant opposition to this from groups that are normally considered constituency groups and supporters within the Democratic Party?
No, in fact, they often cite the wage and income benefits associated with this law. The analogy I've seen, my colleague, is if you were to take a worker who does earn the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, 40-hour work week, that's $290 a week, and to compare that with someone who gets dropped down below the 30-hour threshold to 29 hours a week, let's say you were to pay them, I'll choose a number, $10.10 an hour. That's the exact same amount of weekly wages under this law. So for those who are concerned about wages, and that's all Americans, this is a bill that they ought to be supporting.
Well, and I don't think I was particularly clear in my question, but what I wanted to suggest is that there are a lot of groups, labor unions, a lot of constituencies that normally would be associated with the Democratic Party that favor this legislation, and honestly that view it, and many of these groups don't want to repeal the legislation outright. They do think this is a real problem that needs to be addressed and fixed. And, to my friends on the other side of the aisle, we hear this, it is a canard, frankly, that you've tried to repeal this 50 bill. 7 of those bills became law, which means they passed a Democratic Senate and they were signed by the president, and they certainly weren't repeal efforts. They were everything from eliminating the 1099s, that even the long-term health care provision that Secretary Zavilia said was, unaffordable in the form in which it was originally passed. I think the chairman makes a really important point. The only people that have been suggesting and enacting, with the consent of the president and the support of the Senate, any fixes to the bill has been the Republican majority. This is the only piece of legislation of this size and length. I don't know of a single Democratic bill that's designed to fix and strengthen this. There may be one out there. There's a lot of legislation, but I have not seen our friends who constantly challenge us, will work with us to fix it. This is exactly what this is. Now, you may agree or disagree with it, and the last time I checked, we're not bound to only consider measures that the President of the United States tells us ahead of time that he wants to support. I don't think we operated that way in 2007 and 8 when my friends were in the majority and George Bush was president. We don't operate that way now, nor should we ever operate that way. It's not up to the executive branch to dictate to the Congress what measures it's going to consider or not. But a substantial number of the pieces of legislation that are lumped as repeal efforts, again, have become law, or were like this one, whether it becomes law or not, it's not an effort to repeal. I certainly in my district have heard from constituents, everything from owners of businesses to workers in businesses to universities who are not allowed to have adjunct professors work the number of hours they used to. Said, please fix this. And these are not necessarily opponents of the entire legislation. They just say, I would actually argue that what's happening here, and what I wish my friends would consider, is an unintended consequence of the law. I don't think the president or my friends in the majority ever meant for people to lose hours working because of the legislation was passed. But that's indeed happening to millions of Americans, and they're in many cases the people least able to afford losing hours. So, again, fair enough to disagree with us that this is the appropriate fix, but one, you ought to be trying to fix that problem because lots of people have it. And so if you've got a different solution, I'm with my friend the chairman. I'd sure like to see it. And second, don't call this an effort to repeal when it is no such thing. It is a bipartisan effort to fix. May or may not have support enough to get through the Senate or to the president's desk or past it. But again, 7 times when we've been told this was an effort to repeal, it has actually ended up becoming law. So I want to commend my friend for what he's doing, because he's doing exactly what the president asked him and this majority to do. That is, find some things you don't like about it and work with us to fix it. So we've picked out one that has bipartisan support that is genuinely causing millions of Americans a hard time, and we said, here's our solution. We would hope our friends on the other side do the same thing. I think you're to be commended for what you're doing here. Please.
Thank you. Thank you.
And, I'm proud of this Congress for continuing to work on it. And, Mr. Chairman, I'm particularly proud of you for issuing what I think is a legitimate and appropriate challenge to our friends on the other side. Do you really think this thing came down from Mount Sinai is so perfect that there's not anything wrong with it, that there's not any legislation? And I would challenge my friends on the other side. give us your list of things. I think that's a perfectly appropriate challenge to put forward. Or do you think it's so good that there's nothing wrong with it at all? And if you have a different opinion as to what's wrong with it than we do, great. Let's put it out there in legislation. Let's let our friends on Ways and Means have an opportunity to work in a bipartisan fashion. Because, again, 7 times we have actually done that and have changed the law, saving Americans billions of dollars, and I think making what I still believe is a very flawed law marginally better. And so you're to be commended for a real effort to try and make something better and address a real problem.
Well, thank you. And I'm here today in the spirit of extending an invitation to work with folks on the other side of the aisle on any areas related to the ACA and the broader economy, so that we can get folks back to work, so that they can work the number of hours they want and enjoy the wages they want. So I hope if this isn't it, or if you have recommended improvements to this and want to introduce your own bill, I'll give that due consideration.
Well, and just one last observation, really. I know my friend wasn't here during the consideration of this legislation, initial legislation. I wish you had been, and I wish a lot of your friends had been, because this bill would probably not have happened remotely in the form that it is. And and you were elected in large part to try and correct and undo what people see in abuses, and you're doing exactly what your constituents sent you here to do. Again, I recognize that when we lost the majority, the folks on the other side who I didn't agree with were doing what their constituents sent them here to try and do. Fair enough. This is America. So there's nothing illegitimate. There's nothing futile. And by the way, over time, again, a lot of this stuff magically does work its way into law. You do win the argument, and whether this becomes law this time or not doesn't mean it won't in the next Congress. It doesn't mean that it won't eventually. And so again, I appreciate what my friend is doing. And Mr. Chairman, you've been generous with the time. I'm sorry, and I yield back.
Appreciate the gentleman's comments, and gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Hey, it's my understanding that this bill would cost about $74 billion, and it looks like, I just want to be, so are you requesting a waiver of the cut-go rule, or do you have a pay-for that you propose for the $74 billion?
Don't have an identified pay-for. I celebrate the economic growth associated with putting millions of Americans back to work at the number of hours they want to work, and there's a dynamic impact here of $75 billion in foregone wages associated with this bill. That money will be spent back into the economy, and so, with respect to its fiscal impact, that's where we'll end up. I'd also note that it will result in roughly an additional $9 billion in payroll tax revenue.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to submit the second page of the CBO report citing a cost of $73.7 billion.
Without objection.
And I would expect that if there's no pay-for proposed, it's very likely that this rule will waive the cut-go rule, which is designed such that when that legislation does not impact the deficit, meaning that absent some other legislation, a pay-for this, or some Republican tax increase that they intend to spring upon us, this bill will cost $74 billion to the deficit. I'll be happy to yield.
The gentleman, Mr. Cole, a minute ago made a statement that he felt like this was an unintended consequence. You're telling me it was an intended consequence.
I'm making no judgment about
$75 billion, you cut people's work hours.
I'm making no judgment about intention. I'm citing the CBO report saying this impacts the deficit by $73.7 billion.
Well, it sounds like the CBO got it, and they understood it, that was the intent, Mr. Cole. So I'm not trying to take you on, but it seems like that was the intent, not unintended. I appreciate the gentleman clarifying that.
I'm making no reference with intent or non-intent, but for this bill to be considered by the House, the committee will have to consider a waiver of the cut-go rule as part of the rule. I expect to see that there, meaning that this bill would increase the deficit by $73.7 billion unless there is an offsetting Republican tax increase that we haven't seen yet, or cuts somewhere else that we haven't seen yet. So We will see that when the rule is proposed in mere moments from now. I yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, and I apologize this question was already asked, but I couldn't help but think, hearing the exchange between you and Mr. Cole, about how the majority welcomes the ideas and thoughts of the minority in this House. Are you recommending and requesting for an open rule on this bill?
No, that is not my recommendation. My recommendation is that we sit down, have an honest dialogue, and figure out how we can come up with a better health care product for the American people than perhaps the Affordable Care Act. But if there are specific provisions of the Affordable Care Act that you actually believe are suboptimal in this massive piece of legislation, then I'm happy to work with the gentleman in removing those pieces and perhaps replacing them with things that make more sense.
But not on the floor of the House in an open, transparent debate.
Well, yeah, I sense some irony with respect to openness and transparency when I recall the history of how this legislation was passed, and in large measure what caused me to run for office originally.
No, I was here, and a lot of that history is distorted, I'll tell you. But let me give you some more recent history, and that is Speaker Boehner's. Let me just give you a little bit of history. That the House held nearly 100 hours of hearings and 83 hours of committee markups on the Affordable Care Act. We heard from 181 witnesses, both Democrats and Republicans. 293 amendments were considered in the 3 committees of jurisdiction, 121 of which were adopted. The bill was available for 72 hours before members were asked to vote on the bill. I go right down. I read the entire history, but let me just say, give you more recent history, and that is when Speaker Boehner became Speaker, he said, "You know what? We're gonna do these things very differently. We're gonna have more open rules than you ever can believe possible. We're going to err on the side of openness and transparency." And you've had more closed rules than in your time here than we did. And so I'm just, I appreciate all these offers for quiet discussions in the back rooms. But what I'm just saying is that, if people have ideas, not just Democrats but Republicans, they want to bring them to the House floor, they ought to be able to bring them to the House floor under if we want to have that kind of exchange. So, but apparently the answer is that's not what you're requesting.
Well, if the gentleman respectfully is planning for the old days of transparency and openness and bipartisanship of just a few years ago and inclusion of the minority party, I think he is distorting history.
No, what I'm trying to do is I'll be happy to provide you the word-for-word transcript of Speaker Boehner's speech to the Congress, which was pretty explicit about the way he wanted to run this House. And that's not the way it's being run. So
I look forward to working with you. I don't think major pieces of legislation, like an omnibus massive health care piece of law, ought to be passed in a strictly partisan fashion. And I think when we're dealing with major provisions that are causing low-income workers to lose hours, to lose wages during a down economy, we need to work together. And I'd invite you, sir, to come up with some constructive solutions related to this, if this is not one you can sign on to.
Thank the gentleman from Massachusetts. I was, critical of. I'm critical of my own party if they propose deficit spending. I'm critical of Republicans if they propose deficit spending. But at the time of enormous deficits, bringing before us a bill that increases the deficit by $73.7 billion just seems to be the wrong direction. Isn't part of your mandate to reduce the deficit? And shouldn't there be some offset that reduces the deficit in this bill, or at least leaves it the same, rather than increases it by $73.7 billion? I yield to the gentleman.
Question's been asked, and I thought I answered it, but the idea here is to put more people back to work, at more hours, growing the economy.
So we're clear all the time. I mean, there's all sorts of things. Democrats have ideas. Let's, spend money on infrastructure, or let's do a bailout of this, and they spend money, and you guys are spending money. It all has a nice cause. It all is like to put people back to work, or it's to invest in good things. We all like to do it, but at the end of the day, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And it's not any better for Republicans to engage in deficit spending than Democrats. And here we see a bill where, again, if it was allowed under a rule that would allow different pay-fors to be discussed on the floor, we could at least discuss perhaps different ways of paying for it. And maybe your way of putting people back to work is better than some other government spending that it would take the place of. But if all you're advancing is this government spending bill that increases the deficit by $73.7 million, I don't see how anybody who's fiscally conservative could possibly support such a bill in a time of increasing deficits. So I hope that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will hopefully advance a rule that allows a discussion of cut, go, and pay fors, but in the absence of that, simply say no to a deficit-busting bill that only increases our deficit at a time we need to move in the opposite direction. I yield back my time.
Chairman yields back time. Mr. Young, just so you're aware of this, I'll take the heat on this. For anybody to believe that we need to take it out on lower-income workers to save the government $73 billion is a pretty sad case. And I will tell you the Republican majority will take the heat for you. It is not an unintended consequence. They wanted the $73 billion revenue, and they evidently understood that it would cause 40-hour work week change to 30, where millions of Americans would lose their job. And they would take it out on them and make them have to work harder and have to sweat it out. So don't worry about it. We got your back on this one. And I understand what they're trying to do. Don't let them rattle you. I'll take the heat on this one, and I appreciate you being here. The gentleman from Massachusetts seeking recognition. The gentleman's recognized.
Is the chairman changed his position on whether or not he's going to demand a pay for the extension of unemployment insurance benefits for those who are unemployed in this country? I mean, why are we taking it out on these people? And if I remember correctly, this Congress also paid for a farm bill by cutting food stamps for poor people. You know, we don't ask for a pay for this, but you've got to have a pay for extending unemployment insurance benefits. I'm just trying to understand the logic here.
Well, I'll explain the logic to you, and I was completely, all my words are taken out of context. I believe that we do need to have, if there's a choice, to have a minimum wage increase, but it needs to be accomplished and accompanied by having at least an equal number of economic opportunity jobs that would be available. I believe it is unfair and wrong for us simply to give a 3-month extension on unemployment compensation when people need jobs. We're now realizing more and more and more, Mr. Young, that there are not unintended consequences. This is exactly what the President of the United States intended. This is exactly what the Democrat majority intended to do. They intended to hold hostage millions of Americans and their paycheck to get $73 billion for the good old government. I'll sustain that one. And the Rules Committee and this committee right here today will stand up for the American people, the middle class of this country, who are hearing it loud and clear right now, again, in the Rules Committee. Okay to stick it to people who are trying to make a living, but we got to understand this $73 billion for the government. We got to have that money. It's not an unintended consequence. It was intended this way, and we're going to stand up and sustain your good ideas, and I appreciate you taking the heat today. I think some of you guys from Indiana can handle your own.
This Marine's not feeling any heat, so thank you, Chairman.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the recognition. I appreciate my classmate for being here. It seems like a lot longer than 3 years ago that we showed up here, but I thought it was interesting what you said about when we were at home, not members of Congress, many not even thinking about entertaining the idea that one would want to be a member of Congress, but being so frustrated sitting at home at the direction things were going that folks decided to run. I confess I share Mr. Polis's concerns about Cutco. I think it's important that we're all budgeteers. So many of our folks in our class are budgeteers. I've been trying to understand that CBO report, and you may understand it better than I do. The only revenue part of this provision that you're appealing is to say that if folks aren't providing insurance to their employees, we're going to fine them. Is that where the revenue line comes from? What is this revenue that the CBO says we're going to lose? Is it just fines on employers?
That's right, yeah.
So when we're talking about trying to get folks access to health care, We're not talking about revenue that was going to pay for health care. We're not talking about revenue that was going to provide anybody with health care. We're talking about fines on employers who were not providing health care. That's the revenue stream.
Yeah, often low-margin employers who are the productive part of our economy and creating jobs for workers that need them most.
It concerns me the cavalier nature in which some of my colleagues treat your testimony here, because I think it's incredibly important. You sit on Ways and Means. I don't envy what you do over there. Do you have any bills, and I'm just a little outside of your wheelhouse, but do you have any bills that you're aware of that are designed to fix the President's health care system that the Senate has passed and sent over here to you, and it's just waiting on the Ways and Means Committee to act on to move forward? Are there fix Obamacare bills from the Senate waiting in your committee?
No.
But I ask you that because if not you proposing these fixes, I don't know who's going to do it. I mean, we've got a laundry list of somewhere between misguided and completely broken ideas that were used to pay for this bill. This bill that was the $1 trillion bill that we're not going to let it go over $1 trillion, so we're going to delay it for 4 years so it won't go over $1 trillion. Thinking about the bills Mr. Cole mentioned, we repealed the 1099 reporting for small businesses. We did that. We sent that to the Senate. They passed it. The President signed it. That was a revenue raiser designed to pay for this monstrosity, but we had to repeal it because it was completely unworkable, completely destructive of not just the small business economy, but for those workers that we purport to be trying to help. The Class Act, as Mr. Cole mentioned, Health and Human Services Secretary says, completely unworkable. And these are the things designed to pay for this bill that have had to be repealed one by one. And yes, this 40-hour work week requirement, one of those things designed to pay for the monstrosity. And you're saying, for Pete's sakes, it's hurting the very people it was intended to help. I have to go back to, you may have more information than I do, to something my colleague from New York said earlier. She said she was going to disabuse you of the notion that Mr. Hoffa supported this change. I'm looking at a letter, one of the reasons I asked about whether you've received anything from the Senate to fix it. I'm looking at a letter that Mr. Hoffa wrote last summer, 9 months ago, and he didn't address it to the President, he didn't address it to McConnell or to Speaker Boehner. He addressed it to Leader Reid and Leader Pelosi. And he says, and I quote, right now, again to Leader Reid and Leader Pelosi, right now, unless you and the Obama administration enact an equitable fix, the Affordable Care Act will shatter not only our hard-earned health benefits, but destroy the foundation of the 40-hour work week that is the backbone of the American middle class. I only ask you that because I have seen no one work harder to be a bridge builder here in Washington, D.C. than you have in your 3 years. But is there something that I don't know about that makes your effort to right this wrong that has been identified both by Republicans and by labor union leaders across the country? Is there something that I don't understand that makes this appear to be a partisan solution instead of the very solution that folks on both sides are asking for?
No, there's not, and I appreciate the question. I cited Mr. Hoffa because I thought it would illustrate the bipartisan nature of this. Some have characterized it as a fix, others as a repeal of a major provision, regardless of where anyone comes from on that. I think it illustrates that people of different philosophies can come together to help our most at-risk workers, our lower-income workers. So Mr. Hoffa evidently was early to recognize the deficiencies in the 30 hours full-time provision.
He talks about his support of the bill from the very beginning, about how hard he worked to make it a reality. And it's interesting to me, the words he uses, that his vision has come back to haunt us because of all of the, whether intended consequences that nobody knew about, passed the bill to see what's in it, or the unintended consequences that were there. He mentioned two things in that letter that troubled him. But number one was this one, that again, apparently the Senate does not have a proposal to fix this. Letter to Leader Reid has not resulted in Senate legislation, or there is companion legislation moving there?
There is some legislation. There's some movement over in the Senate. Senator Collins and Senator Donnelly, Republican, Democrat, have worked together. I would wish they would have more support over there in the Senate, and my hope is that we can get some momentum, bipartisan momentum coming out of the House, and that the number of supporters for this change will grow. And you know, as to the future, I think if we can pass it out of both the House and the Senate, then that only enhances our ability to persuade the President that this is the right thing to do.
Mr. Hoffa again cited two problems in the letter that he wrote, but he named this one number one as the top priority. And he says, the law creates an incentive for employers to keep employees' work hours below 30 hours a week. Now, my colleagues have said there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that is happening. I'm thinking that the leader of one of the largest labor unions in the country is in tune with labor policy across the country and speaks with authority. Is there any suggestion that this law will have no impact on folks because no one is keeping those hours down? Or did I understand you correctly to say the CBO has scored it and said, no, this is absolutely keeping hours down, and the passage of the Young legislation is going to raise both hours worked and wages received?
Well, that's right. We have the CBO weighing in and a number of outside groups who've already been cited. And more importantly, I think all of us have examples from our own districts, and I've cited those, from community colleges to private sector to our universities and so on. So we know this is already incentivizing, oftentimes against the employer's will. The employer to drop somebody down below that 30-hour threshold just because they cannot afford to provide the Affordable Care Act sanctioned health insurance.
Mr. Hoffa goes on to say numerous employers have begun to cut workers' hours to avoid this obligation, and many of them are doing so openly. The impact is twofold, as you have identified, Mr. Young. Fewer hours means less pay while also losing current benefits. It is disappointing to me. Again, I know you in your time here to have been a bridge builder. If you'd brought a bill today to repeal all of Obamacare, I'd have been the first one to stand up and say, hooray for you, let's do it. But the truth is that's not what you brought. My colleagues mentioned all the children who are being helped because they're on their parents' policies. Your bill today does nothing to adversely affect that. They talk about pre-existing conditions, folks being helped. Your bill does nothing to undermine that. Your bill does one thing and one thing only, and that is to solve a problem that has been universally identified as impacting not large employers. They're going to sort it out, but impacting the workers themselves. And I think Mr. Polis is right on target when he talks about the need to focus on pay-fors and have a single set of rules that apply across the board. But I don't for the life of me understand why we have something like this, which my understanding is had no amendments offered by Democrats in committee. Is that accurate?
That is accurate.
The bill went through the regular order there?
The regular order.
And so here we have a bill done the way a bill is supposed to be done, co-sponsored by folks on both sides of the aisle, fixing a problem that groups on the left and groups of the right identify as a problem, and yet we characterize it as some sort of political hack job as opposed to an earnest effort to make a difference in the lives of the men and women.
Will the gentleman yield for a moment?
And Democrats serve. I'd be happy to yield to my friend from Colorado.
I believe if there was an offsetting spending cut, I believe it would have had to come through the Appropriations Committee, a different committee, which might be why that committee wasn't able to consider what spending to offset for purposes of this bill. Happy to yield back.
Well, I thank my friend. It's a revenue offset, right? I mean, it's revenues that are going. So I think we have the correct committee of jurisdiction, and I believe if we were to move forward on Chairman Camp's fundamental tax reform proposal that he moves forward, which moves forward in a revenue neutral way, it actually collects these revenues that we're talking about. But
I'm going to yield for just one further moment.
Absolutely, but I just want to ask my friend before I yield. You're not suggesting that there was any sort of subterfuge in the way this bill was moving through process, try to avoid some sort of accountability. I don't think that's what the gentleman
I'm
suggested.
suggesting we move forward with Chairman Camp's proposal. And I would be happy to consider this as part of Chairman Camp's tax simplification proposal, and I hope that we can bring that before this committee soon.
I know the gentleman is sincere in that request for a host of different reasons, but I do it. Even in that big class that you and I came in with, this second big class, I'm told that by the end of this next election cycle, more than half of the U.S. House of Representatives will have been here 5 years or less. I'd like to believe that both old members and new members are here to get something done, and I apologize. You are here. Your heart's in the right place. You've been working hard. You've been going through regular order. You've been bringing people together on both sides of the aisle, and you deserve better than to have it suggested that you're part of the Repeal Obamacare crusade. What you are a part of is the Let's Make a Difference in Real People's Lives crusade, and I wish there were more crusaders lined up behind you. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back some. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
I would yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Yeah, just for President Hoffa's name has been brought up quite a bit here. I just want to read a statement that they put out today. This is entitled, "The following is an official statement by Teamster President James Hoffa. In July, I co-wrote a letter to Senator Harry Reid and Representative Nancy Pelosi expressing our concerns about specific provisions of the Affordable Care Act and the potential unintended consequences of these provisions. The concerns outlined in the letter have been taken out of context by anti-worker legislators and political organizations in an attempt to bolster their own arguments against the ACA. They are further trying to show that there is some broad movement to derail the ACA from all sides of the political spectrum. Though we may have concerns with specific provisions of the ACA, we share the President's goal of ensuring that every American has affordable access to top-quality health care. It is on this main point that we disagree wholeheartedly with the efforts of extreme right-wing Republicans to gut the ACA. Any suggestion otherwise is simply political posturing." He then goes on to add, "I call on Senator Ted Cruz, Senator David Vitter, and others to cease and desist from misusing our constructive comments in their destructive campaign to hobble the President and the nation. Working Americans are fed up with the continued cycle of holding the government and the economy hostage to achieve some empty political victory. Working families are the only people hurt by Republican maneuvering to shut down the government and play Russian roulette with the debt ceiling." That's the end of the statement, but I thought it would be important, since his name has been invoked so much, that we read that into the record. And I would just remind the gentleman, Mr. Woodall, that even though he's only been here as a member for only a few years, he was here as a staff member for almost as long as I was. So he knows how this process works inside and out very well. But anyway, I thought it was important to put that on the record. I thank the gentleman for that.
Would the gentleman yield to a question?
I'm sorry, does the gentleman yield back his time to, or does he wish to engage his gentleman from Georgia?
I would yield to Mr. Woodall.
Mr. Hastings controls the time. Gentleman's recognized.
I was trying to listen as the gentleman from Massachusetts was reading that letter. I've not seen that letter. He was talking about derailing the entire ACA versus trying to pass target legislation to fix specific parts of it. Mentioned some members that were that he thought were part of the problem, and others. Did mention folks that were part of the solution, but there was no reference to this specific rifle shot piece of legislation or to Mr. Young's efforts. That was presented as if it was a rebuttal to Mr. Young's efforts here today. It seems to really be a rebuttal to what's going on with some Republican senators, not to the hardworking efforts of the gentleman from Indiana. I yield back and thank the gentleman.
I yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
My guess is, my suggestion would be that I would be careful before I try to take Mr. Hoffa's words and try to apply them to this legislation or any other legislation, when that's not what he did not come out and specifically endorse any legislation. And again, I think he's pointing to the larger issue, which is one that we're complaining about, is the multiple times that we have tried to, that you have tried to derail the Affordable Care Act. And what he's suggesting is that maybe we ought to spend our time more constructively doing something else, and that's what I suggested in my earlier comments, whether it's extending unemployment insurance for those who are long-term unemployed, whether it's raising the minimum wage, or whether it's passing comprehensive immigration reform. We ought to do something that is going to help the American people, and I don't think this is going to be it. So I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Thank you very much. And as a follow-on to that discussion, Mr. Hoffa represents an extraordinary union, the Teamsters. I have been very close to them through the years. but the Teamsters as an organization have not made a position on H.R. 2575, but I would have to have you know that there are more unions in this country than the Teamsters, and that virtually all that I've been in touch with, the AFL-CIO, the NEA, AFSCME, I even participated in registration of participants in the Affordable Care Act with SEIU union persons. And there are others, the laborers union, countless in my neck of the woods, are very supportive of this measure. But let me ask Mr. Young, is there any danger if in what you're offering, allowing the raising of this threshold, of some workers losing their employment because employers make a determination that they are not going to put forward 40 hours for them to work?
I think if I could ask the gentleman to restate the question. I'm not sure I understand. The object here is to create an opportunity for people to work more hours and earn more wages.
Understood.
Right.
But is there any danger that other people may lose their jobs because of that? An employer determines that, in other words, this threshold, cite for me other than in overtime provisions, and the Affordable Health Care Act, anywhere else in labor law that 40 hours is a threshold?
Right. The Fair Labor Standards Act offers time and a half, right?
Overtime.
Right, right.
Yeah, but beyond that, any other provision that you can cite?
So perhaps what you're getting to is that the 30-hour provision within the Affordable Care Act could indeed create some sort of legal precedent, which, based on your background, is probably where you're coming from on this, sir.
Right.
And so that legal precedent could open up the door to some other unintended consequences, redefining full-time down to a lower threshold. I think the bigger danger here, if I could, sir, is that we create a lower threshold than what has traditionally been recognized as full-time in this country, thus undermining the profitability of our private sector organizations and the viability of those that don't operate for profit. They go under, we have a less efficient economy, and jobs are killed in the process. So that would be my concern.
What is the percentage, Mr. Young, of employees who work 30 hours a week in this nation?
I don't have that at hand. I can get that to you.
Let me suggest to you that it's 8%. Do you know the percentage of people that work 40 hours or more in this country?
I suspect you have that at hand, so please.
43%.
Yeah.
In short, the other question that I would put to you is, in the last 5 years, has there been an increase in the number of people that are working 40 hours a week?
That's probably also part of your notes.
10% increase.
Yeah.
And the point being that while I understand a part of where you're coming from, and there may be some wisdom, but experience teaches that employers in this country have been about the business of reducing the hours way before there was anything known as the Affordable Health Care Act. And it depends upon the industry. Some industries work people absolutely too hard and too long, in my judgment, but they require that in order to get the product that they're seeking at a given time. The simple fact of the matter is this nation is in transition, and with reference to our economic circumstances and employment generally, we find that things are changing, and they're changing rapidly, and I think changing for the worse. Your party doesn't want to increase the wages of people whether they work 30 hours or 30 minutes. Your party is of a mind that somehow or another all of these things that are taking place in our society came about because of something called Obamacare. The simple fact of the matter is that it did not. I've cited in this committee more times than a little, and I'll cite again, that it has been a period of 40 years that America's economy has changed. It didn't just change in 4 hours. It didn't change when Barack Obama became president or when George Bush became president. It started quite some time ago. And next year, just next year, industry is going to make 37% more profit than they are making generally in this country, and they're going to reduce employment by 17%. Now, somewhere along the line, this is crazy. We can't keep putting up all this kind of stuff. Now, get over it. Not you, Mr. Young, but the Republican Party, and especially some on this committee that are my colleagues. Get over it. Yesterday, however, they got to the number of 7.1 million, and I suggest before the end of the year it'll probably be 15 million. So the doggone act is here to stay, whether you like it or not. And the fact of the matter is we need to be on about our business rather than continuing a process that's going to cause the kind of friction that keeps coming up. Somewhere along the lines, I believe that we are a better people than that, we're a better persons in this Congress than that, and we owe the American people more than we are giving them. We use the same bridges, we use the same roads, we use the same stores, all of us, whether we're Republican or Democrat. And somehow or another we've gotten to something that I find absolutely confusing. How in the world could you not want people to have health insurance? I just, for the life of me, do not understand that. And if you were to be successful in repealing, then what are you going to do with all of these people that are going to be thrust back into the environment that they were in before? I think you will find that insurance companies now will see stability and that we can move on. And I don't think that the issue that you're raising is going to go anywhere fast other than to the floor of the House of Representatives, and that will be the end of it. And this one-party legislation needs to stop. And we need to pay attention to what we need to do for America generally. Not you, Mr. Young. Talking to others on this committee, and they know who they are. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Young, I appreciate you taking this on behalf of the team. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate it. Don't know what more I can add to this lively debate. Obviously, a few years ago, it was one-sided in a different way that our friends from the other side of the aisle like to forget. I wasn't here. You weren't here because we came in at the same time. But we came here because of what a lot of folks felt was something that was just jammed down their throats without the deliberative process that our good friends like to talk about. But at the end of the day, you know, if in my good friend from Florida talked percentages about those that work 40 hours, those that work 30 hours, but to somebody who was working 40 hours to get cut back to 30 hours, and I'm sure his hourly rate didn't increase to offset the difference, how does that family make it? How does that family not become more dependent upon government, but how do they become less dependent on government if we cut their hours? How does that work?
So in the example you've cited, where you're effectively cutting a week's worth of wages from an hourly worker, based on your example, over the course of a month. And you know, I run into these individuals. We all do. We all do, regardless of party, which is why this is a bipartisan bill and why I appreciate the passion and the bipartisan sentiment that I've heard here in this room. You know, I don't know how they make it.
It just seems that, and I hear this, the mantra is that we've voted 50-plus times. The president put it in whatever letter he put out to repeal or replace portions or all of the Affordable Health Care Act. And I've heard all the discussion about HOFA, and I've heard both letters being read. But in the last letter, I never heard him say that, hey, listen, 30-hour work week's a good idea. Did he say that anymore? Did he say that 30-hour work week is a good place for us to go? Did he say that in anything that you've heard today?
I just heard the most recent letter. Earlier was the opposite position. But, you know, I mean, what one individual says is unimportant to me. I think the point is here that whether you're a Republican or Democrat or progressive or conservative, we need to allow people to work the number of hours they need to earn the wages they require to live during this down economy. People need to be able to, you know, when you have fewer people in the labor force or people who are working fewer hours, it's hard for me to understand, as someone who has a bit of an economics background, how you grow an economy.
We really need jobs, right?
Yes.
We've passed some very bipartisan pieces of legislation in the House that maybe weren't giant job creators, but they had the ability to create jobs, allow private companies to create jobs. Passed them in the House, bipartisan, largely bipartisan bills. Whatever happened with the majority of those when they went to the Senate? Do you have any idea?
Reporting indicates very little. So sometimes, yeah, they're just not considered on the floor of the Senate.
Well, my colleague Gil,
Absolutely.
you and I come from Florida.
Mm-hmm.
We just got through talking about jobs. The bills that you passed went to the Senate and they died, okay? And that's wrong in my judgment. But you know what else is wrong? Our governor, mine and yours, denied under this Affordable Health Care Act, at least the legislature did, and he certainly didn't push to try and allow for the expansion of Medicaid. That results in 1 million Floridians not having an opportunity to have insurance and 175,000 jobs.
I'll reclaim my time. The gentleman is always on the same mantra every time. Wants to point fingers at the governor of Florida. And I understand it because he's got a guy who's running against the governor of Florida who was a Republican, wasn't independent, now he's a Democrat. Got it. Understood.
Glad he's a Democrat.
And I'm sure you are glad he's a Democrat. At the end of the day, the governor, and I'm not going to hit, I agree, so am I. At the end of the day, whatever the governor of the state of Florida does, he does with whatever the best intentions are. Whether those on the left agree with that or not, that's fine. But we're talking about people, real people, that are losing hours that go to their paycheck to allow them to support their families. So all this other stuff you hear about, these are real people that have real jobs that are getting cut to 30 hours, real people. And they need 40 hours at least to survive. So, you know, we can argue about how you pay for it, but at the end of the day, it really is about people in my community that has one of the highest unemployment rates of the state of Florida. I worry about them in my home county. Forget about all this other stuff. I worry about those folks in my home county that have one of the highest unemployment rates in the state of Florida. That's why I'm here. That's why I decided to run for this crazy office, to be up here. Because I used to protect people in a different way. And I'm trying to do the same thing in a different way up here. And so I appreciate, Mr. Young, where you're trying to take this. I laud your efforts.
Would the gentleman yield
I would absolutely
before you're done?
Mr. Young, did you have something?
Thank you for being a co-sponsor on this bipartisan piece of legislation.
If I could, Mr. Young, I didn't want to say anything earlier because I was hoping we'd get to votes before we're done. I also didn't want to say anything because this bill is extremely personal to me. Everyone has talked about the statistics and the numbers and the percentages. It's the guy who lives directly across the street from me who's impacted by this. It provides a great service to our community. And the community did provide him with benefits as a thank you for that service. But because of the Affordable Care Act, his hours have been cut. the benefit that was received has been taken away simply because the community could not afford to put them on full-time insurance. It is a reality. And I'm looking at the guy, I'm not looking at the guy. In my mind's eye, I am looking at my neighbor who is impacted. He is what this bill is about. So I don't want to go into that because it's very emotional, it's very maudlin. But I want to thank you for this because this means everything to him and the others who work with him in their same service occupation within my community. I'll yield my time. Thank you.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman from Florida yields back his time. Gentleman from Orlando, Florida is recognized. Gentleman does not seek time. Gentleman from Louisville, Texas is recognized. Dr. Burgess. Gentleman yields back his time. Mr. Young, I want to thank you for being here today. As always, I hope you know you did well enough to be invited back, and we look forward to seeing you on the floor. Yeah, don't. Thank you very much. I appreciate you being here today. Great job. Thank you very much. Gentleman's now excused.
Thank you.
The chair would recognize the gentlewoman from Texas. As always, welcome to the Rules Committee. We're delighted that chair, without objection, anything you haven't right will be entered into the record. The gentlewoman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank the Rules Committee for its courtesies. As always, you are here for a long time and giving all of us the courtesies, all of you on both sides of the aisle, and I absolutely appreciate it. I wish I had been able to whisper to Mr. Young to ask for an open rule, because I think that would have followed the process in the early stages of the Affordable Care Act. I do make note of the fact that I was here, and there was an enormous amount of opportunity for amending. I think the gentleman from Massachusetts submitted into the record a long list of the amount of amendments and the amount of discussion. And so I hope that amendments in this instance would be respected as well. This is an interesting day for this to go forward. I think there are about 7 million, 0.21, last number I saw, and growing with respect to those who have now enrolled in the Affordable Care Act. And that does not include the numbers of the states that have their own exchanges. Obviously, the American people are interested in health insurance. I think 4.2 million accessed the healthcare.gov over the last 2 days. And, Mr. Chairman, both of us come from a state that was longing for health insurance. 6 million of fellow Texans were uninsured. And the last couple of days, I was engaged with a great outpouring in the city of Houston, long lines, people staying till 10, 11 o'clock at night. So I offer 2 amendments to reflect that there is a desire for health insurance, and I would make the point that we are concerned about individuals who are facing obstacles in terms of the hours that they have. I offer 2 points, and then I'll offer my amendments. And I ask unanimous consent to offer my amendments en bloc.
That'd be fine.
Okay.
But
I'd make this point that I'm not sure what states. I know the large states have all joined the expanded Medicaid, and the idea of this legislation, the Affordable Care Act, was to provide for individuals who had lower hours without the employer having to do so depending on their income, and they would have been able to participate in expanded Medicaid. Unfortunately, many states opted not to do so. In this instance, I think I would have looked at Mr. Young's legislation maybe more in a more positive light if he had offered to give some larger incentives to employers who would keep the 30-hour week and not reduce the incentives or reduce the health insurance, but give them incentives, higher incentives, if you will, for them to provide that health insurance, a higher tax rebate. And maybe there could have been more who would have been interested in helping. But the reason why I think there's a concern about H.R. 2575 is because I'm looking for the data, the substance. I heard a number, 8% of those who are working 30 hours, and the other numbers are 43%. It looks like there is a small percentage of those individuals which could be fixed by tax, some kind of tax relief for the employer. But my amendment deals with the question of adding to this time that is in this bill an employee's average commuting time in the computation of hours worked for purposes of determining full-time employment. Commuting time has become a major issue for those who work hourly wage jobs because their workday is much longer. According to the Bureau of Census, nearly 8.1% of American workers commute 60 minutes or longer. In 2011, almost 600,000 full-time workers had mega commutes of at least 90 minutes and travel 50 miles or more from their homes. The daily average one-way travel to work for employees nationally is 25.5 minutes. And so I would hope that 1 out of 4 workers cross county lines. My second amendment amends the bill by delaying the effective date of the bill until the first month after there has been 2 consecutive quarters in which the national unemployment rate is below 5%, which would indicate that the nation has reached full employment. You are, in essence, denying people a benefit and undermining the Affordable Care Act, which is very viable or very needed by people in different hourly wages, and not having the level of full employment that we need to have. So I would hope that there would be an open rule. I do want to add that in addition to the comments being made by Mr. Hoffer, the AFL-CIO sent a letter in January of 2014 opposing H.R. 2575 and viewing it as a complete undermining of the Affordable Care Act. It is a repeal. There were opportunities to fix this in a more bipartisan way, more inclusive way that would have included the Senate. And I think everyone wants to ensure that individuals who are at a 30-hour week were not harmed, and by requiring those who work 30 hours a week to have health insurance. But remember, the Affordable Care Act was to provide access to health care for all Americans. It was not to punish employers or small employers. It was to provide a needed service to all Americans. The way to have relieved that was not to repeal a provision that provides for insurance for 30-hour work weeks, but to provide any incentive necessary to make sure that those individuals will keep it. And as I said, one of those could have been added tax relief for the employer. But to now suggest that the 30-hour work persons will not get health insurance so that they get no benefits when this bill specifically provided for them. And I don't know whether the state of the gentleman who made the plea for his neighbor, which I am enormously sympathetic, has the expanded Medicaid, but that was the basis of it. I'd ask my colleagues to consider the amendments that I've offered, and I will yield back my time.
The gentlewoman yields back her time. I'm delighted that you're here today, and would note also that you took a good bit of your afternoon to sit through this, and I appreciate the gentlewoman doing that. Gentlewoman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no questions.
Gentleman from Massachusetts.
To support the general lady's amendments, I have no question.
No questions. Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman, does anyone on the Republican side seek time? See none. The gentleman, Judge Hastings.
I support the lady.
Gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Colorado. Gentleman has no questions at this time. I want to thank you for taking time. A good part of your day has been devoted to coming here with your work for the 2 amendments. And I want to thank you. As always, I know you're welcome here. Thank you. Your ideas. And I want to thank you very much for taking time to do this.
Thank the Rules Committee.
Yes,
thank
ma'am.
you. I ask unanimous consent that my full statement be submitted in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you.
Gentlewoman's next. Excuse. This ends the hearing portion of H.R. 2575, Save American Workers Act of 2014. And the clerk will be, the gentlewoman from North Carolina is recognized for the purpose of the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee grant H.R. 2575, the Save American Workers Act of 2014, a closed rule. The rule provides 3 hours of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Ways and Means. The rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on Ways and Means, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted and the bill as amended shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions of the bill as amended. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You've now heard the motion from the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Is there discussion or amendment to that?
Yes.
Gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee grant H.R. 2575 an open rule so that all members have the opportunity to offer amendments to the bill on the House floor.
Thank the gentleman. Is there further discussion on the amendment from the gentleman from Massachusetts? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor of the McGovern amendment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Noes have it, noes have it.
For a roll call, Mr.
Gentleman has a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox? No. Ms. Fox, no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop, no. Mr. Cole? Mr. Cole, no. Mr. Woodall? Mr. Woodall, no. Mr. Nugent? No. Mr. Nugent, no. Mr. Webster? Mr. Webster, no. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, no. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern?
Aye.
Mr. McGovern, aye. Mr. Hastings?
Yes.
Mr. Hastings, aye. Mr. Polis? Aye. Polis, aye. Mr. Chairman?
No.
Chairman, no.
Clerk will report total.
3 yeas, 8 nays.
The amendment is not agreed to. Not agreed to. Further amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the motion from the gentlewoman from North Carolina. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it. The ayes
Mr.
have it.
Chairman, I ask for a roll call on that.
Gentleman asks for a roll call vote.
Ms. Fox?
Aye.
Ms. Fox, aye. Mr. Bishop? Aye. Mr. Bishop, aye. Mr. Cole? Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall? Aye. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Nugent? Aye. Mr. Nugent, aye. Mr. Webster? Yes. Mr. Webster, aye. Ms. Ross-Lehtinen? Mr. Burgess? Mr. Burgess, aye. Ms. Slaughter? Mr. McGovern?
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings? Yes. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis? No. Mr. Polis, no. Mr. Chairman?
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk will report total.
8 yeas, 3 nays.
Motion is agreed to, and the gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Burgess, will be handling for Republicans.
Ms. Slaughter will be handling it for the
And the
Democrats.
gentlewoman, the ranking member of the committee from New York, will be handling this for the Democrats. The committee will meet at 3 o'clock on Thursday to consider budget reform bills. This finishes our work for the day.